Hello once again to India Narrative Talks. Today we have Professor Ghoshal who will talk about India and its relations with Asian countries, the competition with China, and what is generally happening across the world in geopolitical terms. So may I introduce and welcome Professor Ghoshal, expert on Southeast Asian affairs. Professor Ghoshal, welcome once again.
Thank you.
How do you see India in South Asia and in Southeast Asian countries in that geography? Can you give us an overview here, please?
I think before you really go into India's position in South Asia and Southeast Asia, I think you have to take into account, particularly in the context of current developments, two major things. One, of course, is the COVID-19, the scourge that most probably came from China, and I normally call it Wuhan virus. That has actually created a havoc in the world, taking away very precious lives of many people, as well as putting most of the countries into serious crisis. It has made everything topsy-turvy. That's one development. I think the second development is the moves that are coming from China. It is suddenly becoming aggressive and trying to poach into other spheres in terms of territory and also in terms of waters, particularly in the South China Sea. Now, these two developments, I think, actually had very deep impact in terms of how each of these countries are actually looking at the region and the relationship with the countries of the region. So these two actually had not only deep impact, but it has also created a kind of an economic uncertainty that will have, I think, implications for a long period of time to come, because most of the countries are facing tremendous economic difficulties, essentially because of the effects of this virus, for which many of these countries had to actually carry on lockdown of most of their activities. That has affected the economy. China's bellicosity has really created a much greater uncertainty. It has completely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's advice that bide your time and don't show your strength. China has taken this tremendous kind of action against them. And the so-called wolf warriors of China has practically attacked most of its neighbors.
So, this brings me to the next question, which is one of the ways to be able to match up or to be able to contain China is the Act East policy. How far do you think India has been able to work on it effectively?
There is a misconception that this lookist or actist policy was evolving just to contain China. You know, anybody who is familiar with India's policy towards Southeast Asia know that we had a policy of Southeast Asia towards Southeast Asia for a very long period of time, even in the 50s and in the 60s. Is the focus changed? The focus became more economic, particularly in the early 90s, when India's economy was not doing very well and India opened up its economy so that it could take advantage of globalization, that India was much more interested in developing closer economic links with the countries of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, who had done extraordinarily well in the 70s and 80s, and they were also the entering globalization much faster than, much earlier than us. So our initial emphasis was actually to link up with these countries, to use Southeast Asia as a kind of a springboard through which we could enter the global process and take advantage of this process so that we could develop our economy. In the early 2000s, because the thrust began to change as China became more and more aggressive, assertive in South China Sea in terms of its border disputes with India. Initially in the 90s, China had that charm offensive. China was trying to tell the world that it was rising peacefully. But that, veneer was abundant in the early 2000s when it began to assert itself. And then India had to rethink its look-east policy and focus more on security issues. I would say that India had not done that badly in terms of integration with the countries of Southeast Asia and developing closer security links also in terms of, building, linkages with the countries of Southeast Asia in terms of, security links, in terms of economic links, in terms of, military exercises, and a whole lot of other kinds of institutional arrangements. India became member of East Asia Summit. India also became member of that defense ministers' dialogue process. So institutionally, India became quite integrated with countries of Southeast Asia. But then you have to look into our look-east policy or act-east also from a different angle, in the sense that, Southeast Asian by and large are very transactional. They want you to do something for them in order to, develop much closer understanding between the two regions. China entered globalization much earlier than India. And secondly, United States and Japan, the Western countries, they did enormously for the development of China. If Americans would not have invested their money in China, if the Japanese would not have invested their money in China, I don't think China would have become a manufacturer of the world, a hub of the world. China developed economically tremendously, and the gap between India and China began to grow also exponentially. And the result is that India was finding difficult to actually balance China. I mean, the idea was not contain, but balancing China and to put our own national security at national security right place. That India had to really look for other options. That India alone could not really match with China's both military and economic strength. And it had to develop actually partnerships with the countries of the region whose interests also converged in terms of balancing China, because they thought China was really posing a great threat to the regional peace and stability of the country. At a later stage, we not only devoted to building up coalitions or building up relations with ASEAN countries, but we expanded it to Japan, Australia, United States, and the result was what you see, Quad, that can really take care of the security interest of this region, because there is no consensus or conformity in terms of each other's attitude. So what we see is that different kinds of formations and institutions will coalesce together, and they will be able to balance China's interests. So our Duke's policy is now directed more towards that goal. And secondly, in order to develop also economic linkages, then supply chains and all that, what is more important is the need for
Right.
connectivity infrastructures. So you see an emphasis on connectivity and infrastructures. India has joined with Japan, Australia, United States, and various other countries to put in their each other's efforts together, and so that they're able to. And you see, a lot of formations are coming in, though they have not taken a full shape as yet, but it's a making. It's in the making.
Within the Act East policy, India has been engaging with these countries of Southeast Asia. Within those, do you think India needs to focus more on a country like Vietnam uh, and maybe Thailand? Or do you think India can take the entire grouping together?
Is not a very united group, uh, particularly those who have problems with China and their counterclaims, overlapping claims in South China Sea. They are not willing to take any major stand in regard to China, and they want to play down the threat that China poses. With the result, what we see is that ASEAN is a divided group, and because it, on principles of non-interference in internal affairs and on the principle of consensus in terms of reaching a decision, it becomes extremely difficult for ASEAN to really take any particular decision unitedly. That you see countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand is somehow sitting on the fence. Uh, and Malaysia, until now, was quite sort of low keyed in their approaches towards China, but gradually it is speaking out as they find that China is encroaching more and more into their exclusive economic zone. And they have already actually made an application at one time in 2016, had taken it to the International Court of Justice. And so there are countries who are an enemy or a threat, but behind the scene, they're trying to organize their own strength on the one hand, and on the other, trying to develop some kind of partnership with the countries that can really help them either to build up their own capabilities or to balance China's strength. So, from that perspective, which is very vocal in terms of its criticism of China, and that's why, and also because of our own past relationship with Vietnam, had been always a very close friend. We have stood by them in their difficult times, and Vietnam has a great goodwill for us. It doesn't buckle under too much of pressure from China. It at least asserts its own sovereignty over those areas which it claims. We are trying to build up their capabilities so that they are able to get. We train some of their army personnel. We train their air force personnel. We also provide some kind of support in terms of equipments, and there are talk of Akash missiles and also BrahMos. So is also with Philippines and Indonesia. So we have been trying to pick up at least those countries with whom we think that any security or defense kind of relationship can produce much greater prospect for balancing China's interest in the region. We have been trying to pursue. It stands in their border, and they are afraid of China. There has been some kind of relationship building up between India and the countries of this region.
Now, what is your view? Will India, along with Japan, Australia, and the USA, be able to attain a certain position of itself within the Indo-Pacific region?
I think there are immense possibilities because this kind of formation, these are not alliances. This kind of formations take certain time to mature and to work out all the nitty-gritty aspect of the relationship. But undoubtedly, there are convergence of interests between India, Australia, Japan, Indonesia, United States, in terms of what China has been doing in regard to the question of economic. Because all these countries, because of the long association of investment and other kinds of economic interactions, much of their economy is tied up with China. In the process, they became almost a kind of uh, they're under Chinese seas, that China has seized these countries and they can blackmail also to a certain extent in terms of their economic linkages. Now, that is why things are taking, it would not be possible in the coming years because there are no alternative arrangements for supply chain as yet economically with China and its products unless the Chinese were buying it beef and a whole lot of other things. Then they were facing economic difficulties. But gradually these countries have realized that by emphasizing their economic benefits, they've lost quite a lot in terms of their dependence on China, and it is extremely difficult to extricate themselves from that position. And India and the countries of Southeast Asia, you see there are hesitations on the part of some countries, and they are not fully committed as yet to take a position where we can say that all these formations are able to counter China's bellicosity or aggressiveness. We ourselves are now involved with the border issues with China, and China has not yet fully withdrawn from the Galwan and the adjoining areas.
What would you like to advise a country like India and its other partners like Japan and Australia? How do we go ahead to be able to expedite and hasten the process of, you know, of developing new supply chains and bringing that economy into our countries, India, Japan, Australia, Vietnam? So where are we lacking and what do we need to do? The second part.
Really, you know, there are difficulties, of course, but efforts have been made even with all these limitations. It's not that the cooperation is not going on. For example, India and Japan is cooperating in northeastern India to develop infrastructure. They are also cooperating, India and Japan, in the Africa, you know, Asia-Africa corridor. They are doing it. With Australia also, now there are agreements by which they would be now trying to coordinate their efforts to build up the supply chains. So is with United States. So slowly and slowly, we have been trying to develop some kind of arrangements through which we are able to work out these issues, bring about changes within the system. Is the difficulties in bringing out reforms in our economy, in our various labor laws, the land acquisition, and all these things. Particularly Vietnam, South Korea, the productivity is almost 2 to 3 times that than an Indian laborer. The cost is much less compared to what we have in India. So we cannot really compete in all this. And that's why you find that even though some of the countries have the good intention to support India in its efforts to build up supply chains. They are, after the decoupling, many of these investments are going to Vietnam because Vietnam, the economic, output is much greater and the return is much greater. So, and you know the difficulties within this country, that any reform that you try to bring about in the economic areas, opposition will immediately go against it. And they will see to it that these reforms are not another major hurdle in terms of creating the enabling environment for the supply chains to develop in our country. Take the example of this new labor. Our problem is really lack of implementation and bureaucratic hurdles.
What do you say? We have not really developed uh, much diplomatic or trade effort with Taiwan.
That China is both a determinant as well as a constraint in our foreign policy. Anything we do, we somehow get obsessed with China. We are afraid to do anything that might affect, too sensitive, what China might think about us. The left politics or whatnot has a somewhat a kind of a soft corner for China at certain level. Though many of them know when China gives a damn to your concerns, we should develop closer relationship. Taiwan, particularly Taiwan is developed in chips and other things. And, for a lot of things, Taiwan can really help us. Let us see what happens. They have not accepted Kashmir as a part of India. Now, why should you accept Tibet as a part of China? Even otherwise, they are not very friendly with us. Well, China will also create troubles for us. Will try to, promote insurgency in Northeast and other things. But let us get united. This country can get united and try to develop if whatever capabilities that are required. And we must also shade off, strategic autonomy. Now, what is strategic autonomy? We are dependent on foreign countries for almost 70% of our armaments. We don't have any strategic autonomy. Yes, certain leverage you must keep. We must take advantage of whichever country is willing to help us in some way or the other.
Of the Galwan Valley clash last year. So, how do you foresee and what do you think, or what would you like to advise how India takes up discussions with China about withdrawing from the country, withdrawing from Ladakh?
I think India has to define those red lines, that this far and no further. Let us try to, work out with no inhibitions our relationship with other powers and consensus within the country that this is the red line. Varieties of opinion in this country. Whether those opinions are based on any rational or logical considerations, I'm not so sure. Many of them may be amongst all the political parties that what is it, their concept of India in foreign policy and how they want to deal with China.
Now, what do you have to say about Myanmar? What would you like India to do there? Do you recommend an action by India?
Do anything right at this moment because the situation has gone to a position whereby the two conflicting parties are facing each other and nobody is willing to make any compromise. In this kind of a situation, India has developed closer interactions with Myanmar over the last couple of years, and it has some opening with the country's military, and so was with the civilian government of Aung San Suu Kyi. But now, army is in the dominant position within the country, and ideologically, of course, India would like to see democracy return to this. But then they cannot do anything to persuade the military government at this point to restore democracy. Any kind of concessions to these ethnic groups would divide the country, because the experience of Burma, the earlier name for Myanmar, had not been very pleasant. Immediately after independence, the country actually experienced civil war. And the situation now also is approaching towards the civil war. So my own sort of recommendations would be that both the parties need to be flexible. Both the parties need to step back a little, and then try to advance their hands of friendship. That they cannot go back to could be the beginning. And India also agrees to that 5-point plan, although it might sound to be ineffective at this moment, whereby army still retains certain positions, their reserved seats, some say in the affairs of the ethnic groups, and then whatever form of hybrid democracy that was going on in Myanmar, let that form should come back and wait for, economic development, so that that can produce larger cake. And with that larger cake, each party could be given certain element of incentives to change their position a little bit.
It was wonderful having you on India Narrative Talks. Thank you for the insights that you gave us.
Thank you. It has been my pleasure as well to share some of my views